And we are recording. So welcome to the Mid-Career Mentoring Program and Session 3, Career Pivots. I'm Bethany Brookshire. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a freelance science journalist, and I'll be moderating today's session. And as someone who has done one career pivot already and is currently in the middle of another career pivot, I am expecting everything to hit very close to home. I'm here with my co-organizer, Rodrigo, if you want to do a quick introduction.
Sure, thanks, Bethany. I'm Rodrigo Perez Ortega. I'm a co-organizer of this mid-career mentoring program. I'm a staff writer at Science Magazine, and I also freelance on the side from time to time. And I've also done career pivot, so I'm also excited for this session. Thanks.
And I'd also love for today's mentors to introduce themselves. And I asked them to, when they introduce themselves, to mention their latest career pivot. So Rich, if we could start with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rich Stone, Senior Science Editor at Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Tangle Bank Studios, a documentary film studio. My most recent career pivot was actually moving to the studio. I have a print journalism background and worked many years at Science Magazine. Didn't know anything about filmmaking and took the leap to move to a film studio where I still know nothing about filmmaking, but involved in story development, story selection, and so forth. We'll be glad to talk about that process.
And Roxanne.
Hi, I'm Roxanne, and I was an editor for 12 years at Nature Medicine, which is a trade journal, sister journal of Nature Magazine, covering biomedicine. And my big recent-ish career pivot was in 2019 in December. But I moved to Canada. I left my job. I went full-time freelance. I thought that was going to be like the big life change, and then like the pandemic rolled around like a month later. So that was interesting. And then so I covered COVID for 2 years. I'm still covering COVID as a freelance journalist for I've written for The Atlantic and New York Times and Nature, my old place where I used to work. And also kind of a bonus pivot was I've actually in the last year done some guest hosting of radio programs like On the Media and Science Friday a couple times. So a little audio twist there too, which was unexpected.
So as questions come up, please do go ahead and post them in the chat, put question in all caps next to it, and it will find its way to me via the intertubes, and I will be able to ask them. And of course, we can also have people ask their own questions if they like. So first, we asked in Slack if what people's questions were about career pivots, and a whole bunch of people were immediately like, pivoting to freelancing, because everyone is pivoting to freelancing, especially as newsrooms kind of shrink. And Roxanne, I wanted to ask you about that because you went from being a freelancer to staff and then back to freelance again. And I was wondering if you could kind of tell the story of that shift and how you handled it. You're muted though. You're muted though.
I'm not really good at Zoom. I have done less than 100 Zooms during the pandemic, so this is like still I'm new to this. So what people might not know about me, so I've been a science journalist for 20 years, and I actually did freelance when I first got started. I moved to Berlin, and I pitched Wired at the time, and I luckily got to place a few articles then. So I pivoted after that to working at Nature for 1,000 years. And your question was, how did I navigate that transition back to freelance?
Kind of how did you end up making the shift back to freelance? What kind of made you be like, this is the time?
Right. So I love writing, and I had been continuously freelancing while I was an editor because I love working with writers. I see some people here that I've worked with as an editor, and hopefully I did an okay job because I really, really just adore the process of working on stories with people. But within me, I just missed that calling somebody on the phone and kind of getting the straight story and then writing it, agonizing over it. And so really the key, I guess I'm glossing over, but I want to go back to is I was freelancing throughout the time I was editing, and I was doing that on nights and weekends. I joined the Brooklyn Writer Space. So I'd go to the office during the week, and then on the weekends I would be, and then also, I was in my mid-30s and I was like, I don't think I can do like this double job all the time. So there was a point at which I decided to break free and go full-time freelance. And because I had been continuously freelancing with the blessing of my bosses, and again, on topics that were slightly more general than the trade publication I was at, I was able to kind of more smoothly maybe go into that space of freelance. And the other thing I was going to mention that I've noted is that I'm a big list maker, for better or worse, and Twitter is a great resource. At least it is until now. I was reading a lot of Elon Musk stuff this morning. Hopefully he's not part of this Slack, but or this chat. But I keep when I was an editor, I kept a list of journalists who I either had worked with or wanted to work with. And as I was more actively transitioning to freelance, I really cultivated a list on Twitter of anybody who was an editor in science journalism, health journalism, and who was saying like, pitch me. So I was like, add to list. I can go on, but those are the key points I think I would make.
So if I can chime
that's really
in,
smart.
Bethany.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it depends whether you can control the timing of your pivot to freelancing, right? I mean, some people by necessity have to start freelancing, but if you have control over that transition, one strategy a lot of journalists use is doing a fellowship. So like the Knight Science Journalism Program is a 9-month academic program that many people ostensibly take a leave of absence from their job and say they're going to go back to it, but really they use that time to explore different kinds of writing, different venues to get published in. So there are other fellowship opportunities out there, shorter term fellowship programs, but if you are in control of your destiny that way, I think that's a very attractive option.
You can't just be attacking me like that. I totally took a leave of absence from my job at Science News to do the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship, then ended up going freelance.
I also did you're just making me think I did a fellowship before. I did it at the 11th Hour Food and Farming Fellowship at UC Berkeley. And that's really just 2 weeks away from the job, but it was definitely, it happened in 2016, 2017. So I feel like Rich, you yes, I forgot to say that. I did that too.
So yeah, I did want to ask though, as a follow-up, you mentioned, Roxanne, that you had been doing freelancing on the side. And I know that when I was on staff, it would have been really hard for me to freelance on the side, not just because I'm naturally lazy, but also because it's just, anything that I would have wanted to write about would have been within my purview at Science News. So what do you think there are options for if you're looking to go freelance and are not able to freelance right now?
It's super hard. Like I did food stories, right? Like Nature Medicine's not a food journal. So I was writing about like hypoallergenic peanuts. That's not really something that they would ever cover. And I did clear it just to make double sure. I think that if I don't really have a perfect answer except to say like have a broad purview in terms of the things you can experiment writing about, and if your company's like, we absolutely don't want you to write anything, I think Rich's advice about doing a fellowship is an excellent alternative, because even though I think the Knight Fellowship says you can't freelance while you're part of it, I think there's other kind of fellowship arrangements where you have more latitude to do that kind of thing.
And so I did want to follow up about freelancing. What were some of kind of the biggest challenges to you coming off a staff position and taking up freelance work?
Dollar bills. I mean, like in a nutshell, like I think finance is the largest challenge without question. I moved to a place where the space I live is, I don't know, 1,000 times larger than my walk-up apartment on the 4th floor of a building in New York where my oven didn't open. And, I had to lug my laundry in an IKEA bag blue, this big blue IKEA, like 5 blocks. So I moved to a much cheaper place. And I was actually thinking ahead of this conversation, when I moved to Berlin as a freelance journalist 20 years ago, I was paying 220 euros a month in rent. So, I mean, at the time it seemed like a huge amount, right? But actually, when I wrote an article for Wired, it would cover that rent. So the biggest challenge is, I mean, I could talk about the psychological challenges of being alone and like not having somebody to make jokes with or go to lunch with, but honestly, it's the money that's the biggest challenge. And I would say I'm not the only person I know who's made a drastic move to a much cheaper place in order to be able to go freelance. And also, like, I don't order delivery food. Like, I cook all my meals. So I do economize in ways that might not be apparently visible, but like they're there.
But I also know that for many people who are taking up freelance, one of the kind of things that we're told to cultivate, which, by the way, Christy Ashwanden has previously run freelancing workshops that are great for mid-career. They're like slightly more 101. They're like 201, freelancing 201 workshops on how to go freelance. And I will say that I took that workshop and it was fantastic and helped so much. But also, I was wondering, how do you go about cultivating what I like to call bread and butter clients, the clients that pay the bills, even if they're not, the articles that people coo over and submit for awards, which secretly do not make any money? You're muted again, though.
Again, not a Zoom pro here at all, and also really bad at other social stuff. So in terms of cultivating, like I'm a highly social person. I love talking to people, and I also love being alone. So I think when I was thinking about this in New York, it was a great place to be because, and I'm sure people are living in different city situations, and I've been in different city situations, so you don't need to be living in New York. But before the pandemic, there were in-person conferences of science journalists. There would be like after work drinks. I'm a huge proponent of business cards. I know I sound like a dinosaur, but I think it's a great way to break the ice and just say, here's my card. You read the name tags, don't be afraid of doing that. And then now that we're in the pandemic age, just like I cultivate lists on Twitter of editors, I'm not afraid. Like, I reach out to people to say, that was a great article you guys published. And so I think that's another way to just cultivate a conversation. In terms of the bread and butter clients, I think in some ways, actually freelancing outside the place that I was most attracted to. So I've always been really attracted to genetics, but doing some stories outside of that actually opened some doors and made me think about how to be more versatile and just less attached to the thing that, like, oh, I must write about the thing that I'm most passionate about. So I really suggest if people are looking to pivot and wanting to cultivate like a broader client base, just to kind of do like a crash course in other adjacent topics that might be, opening new doors for them.
So before we move on, I have one more question that comes from the chat. How can freelancers best prepare themselves? And how do you find fellowships that do not require you to be a current student? I think also I would add to that, how do you find fellowships if, say, you have a family and can't necessarily move to Cambridge, Massachusetts for a year, which I know can be really tough for people?
Yeah, I think I can chime in. Although I wanted to say something first, following up on what Roxanne was talking about. I'll date myself here. I was freelancing in the last century, in the 90s. And actually, it's amazing. The rate I was getting at Discover Magazine then is more than I get freelancing for Science Magazine now. I mean, 30 years later, it's ridiculous how little people are paying for freelance stories. So it's hard really to generate sufficient income as a freelancer. There's very few people who can make it kind of a full-time career. That's why, thus, talking about fellowships, I think, is important, because Some of them, and there are many different kinds you can look at, some of them do give you kind of a base income, some contribute toward healthcare costs, et cetera. So I did a Fulbright fellowship twice, actually. First time in the mid-90s. I quit my job at Science Magazine, went off and lived in Russia. The Fulbright program is open to journalists. So it's open to professionals in a range of areas, but journalism is a very big priority of the State Department. So Fulbright, you see a lot of journalists doing that. If you have the kind of ability to pick up and move overseas, I think that's a very good option. There are other fellowships that, to speak to the point, for people who aren't able to move, say to Cambridge or wherever, there's a new fellowship program that the NASW, Society of Environmental Journalists, and the Healthcare Journalists Association together started last year. It's called, not very creative name, it's the Science, Health, Environment Reporting Fellowship. And it's for early to mid-career journalists, and it's tailored to allow you to do it from wherever you're based. You don't have to leave your job. You don't have to leave where you live. Some of the sessions are virtual, but then all the fellows from this inaugural program gathered at the Society of Environmental Journalists annual meeting last month. So it's meant to allow you to kind of look at, explore other topics without a big change to your current situation.
So I also wanted to ask Rich, you in particular, about this. As we reach mid-career, many of us are approaching middle age. Not that I would know anything about that. No, never. And we're starting to get to the point where, like, making some pivots feels kind of weird and scary. So, for example, I will freely admit I do not understand TikTok. I cannot make cute TikTok videos. This is hard, of course, because newsrooms are pivoting to TikTok and they're expanding to other media, such as podcasting and video. And Rich, you did a pivot to video. And I was wondering if you could talk about your experience pivoting in a different medium, as opposed to pivoting in terms of workplace. And how did you kind of prepare for that?
Yeah, so it sounds on the face of it daunting, because I, like many people working in print, don't really have a clue how documentary films are made, or I didn't before I joined the studio. It was a whole new world. But there's approaches, elements of storytelling that are conserved across media. So finding an interesting story, developing interesting characters, constructing a narrative arc for a feature story, all that you do in an ambitious print piece, proactive, enterprising print piece. And this is what goes on behind the scenes of a documentary film before the filming even starts. So my role at the studio is not to get behind the camera ever. They wouldn't let me touch any of the equipment for good reason. I'd probably break something, but to work on the editorial team for selecting stories, for developing the treatments. We both develop stories internally, and then we review proposals from other studios. And so we work together as a team. Kind of the biggest transition for me was how collaborative video and filmmaking is. As a print journalist, you can essentially be a lone wolf. You have to, of course, interact with your editor, top editor, whatever. But it's really you finding the story, you reporting, you going through the editing process, you. But for documentary film, it is a team effort. You are one of many people who are actually integral to seeing an idea go from, a very amorphous idea about what a film might look like to the finished product. So that's been kind of the biggest transition for me, is really realizing and fitting into this broader team effort that generally speaking, you don't kind of take that approach when you're working in print journalism.
I actually wanted to follow up on that because, if you're a writer like me who, finds other humans terrifying, that, that sounds kind of scary. And I was wondering, how did you kind of tackle that, going from kind of this lone wolf writer to that team effort? What kind of transition did that mean for kind of the way you worked, how you communicated, that sort of thing?
It's well, you really have to look at it like it's a learning experience, right? So it's not going in there and saying, oh, I worked at Science Magazine a number of years, I know how things are done, blah 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 blah. It's adjusting to a new style of work. And just for an example, getting into a room with other people on our editorial team, executive producers, the head of the studio, and working on a script together, like batting around, how would we say this in the script? That was such a kind of foreign procedure for me, a foreign way of working. I was just, it was fun, but it was like, can I really think of something on the spot in front of all these other people? I'd rather just sit with the text in a room by myself, mull it, have my cup of coffee, come back to it. No, this is very much interactive. And I guess, you hear stories about how Hollywood productions, how TV series are written, people getting together in a room, and that seems so far removed from our writing experience. But in documentary film, this also happens. So that, and it was a lot of fun before the pandemic when we were all in the room together live in person. It's a bit more awkward when we're doing it by Zoom, but that is how films get made, is all getting together and working it out as a team.
So this next question actually was one that I had planned and then also came up in the chat, and is for, I think, both Rich and Roxanne. When transitioning from freelance to staff, what kind of questions do hiring managers ask about your freelance period? How do you respond? I think I can broaden that question to say, when you're doing a career pivot to things that you haven't necessarily done before, how do you sell the pivot? How do you sell your old skills as applying to the new thing while still saying, oh, but you're probably going to have to train me?
Rich,
Did
do you want
to go
Well,
first?
I was going to say that when I freelanced, my switch to staff was when I was, in my early 20s. And so I didn't really get much of that questioning because, sorry, I should speak closer to this thing. I didn't get much of that questioning because I think people were like, oh, she was but a child. Of course she didn't, So I'm not really sure that I can speak from experience on the end of being the person as transitioning from freelance to staff. But as a person who hired people and things like that, I definitely think that, I wonder if there's really that. There are obviously procedural differences and pay differences and, stability differences between freelance and staff. But at the end of the day, like, there's not that much difference in terms of producing quality science stories or science journalism. And so I think that it's important not to get too psyched up, or I don't know if it's a word, overpsyched about transitioning. Like it is possible.
I would say, as you contemplate a pivot, it's a time to be reflective about what your strengths are. And so if you're in a staff job working for whatever magazine or newspaper, you're doing your share of reactive stories, reacting to the news of the day and developing, longer term feature stories, but you're kind of in a groove, what the editor is expecting and what you can produce. But when you're making that pivot, like, you have to ask yourself, what am I good at? Where do my talents lie? What kind of story do I best tell? So really trying to understand yourself as a storyteller is critical, I feel. And then And then once you've done that, you can have the confidence of projecting where your storytelling skills might apply elsewhere. So I think that's one way to approach it.
So this being a career pivot session, I'm actually going to pivot really quick because I know she has to drop out early. But Teresa, one of the participants in the mid-career mentoring program, has a completely amazing career backstory in that she's the former Coast Guard captain. And she agreed to share some of her career pivot experience with us. So Teresa Carey, I was wondering, would you be willing to talk a little bit about your career pivot and how you ended up making your transition to writing?
Sure. I was doing a lot of sailing and running boats and traveling and things like that. I was a Coast Guard license captain. I was never actually in the Coast Guard, but and then my husband is also a captain, and we just decided one summer we were going to do this trip for fun and not for work, and because we rarely got to sail together. And through a friend of a friend of a friend, a production company found out about our trip, and they wanted to make a movie about it. And so they asked if they could, and they wanted it to be a lifestyle movie. We were sailing on a really small boat and going up to to look for ice, basically, like the area where the Titanic sank. And it's not that far north, believe it or not. But and so we agreed, but we said only if we can be a part of making the film, because I don't want to be like a reality TV person or anything like that. And so what ended up happening was, and my bachelor's is in environmental science, so there's always been, working on the sea, there's always an interest and involvement in science. And so what happened was that year happened to be the year that the Petermann Glacier broke from Greenland. And it happened to be the largest Greenland iceberg on record. And climatologists were concerned about this, and it was all over the news. And so we decided, oh, let's go see the Petermann Glacier or the Petermann Ice Island. And so we were paying attention to the currents and where it goes. And it turns out the fishermen and the sailors know seemingly a lot more than the scientists do about the behavior of these icebergs. And so along the way, we talked to some scientists and some physical oceanographers and some fishermen, and made this Petermann Ice Island the central character of this film. And that was my favorite part, was really telling the climate story behind it. And so it's kind of like a eco-adventure documentary. And it's definitely a rookie film. Like, nobody go watch it anymore. Like, my work is much better than that now. But it is, after that, I was like, oh, I want to do more films like this. And so I figured the best way, my best avenue in would be to continue to sail. And I started offering research under sail expeditions for scientists. And I would like pair scientists and artists and filmmakers all on one boat to collaboratively work together to do science and science communication. And this was and then I would captain. So this was my way of like learning these other skills while providing something that I was good at. And then eventually I just said, okay, I need to get off these boats and make a formal transition. And so I went to UC Santa Cruz Science Communication Program. So that was my transition. I still feel like I'm like transitioning a lot because, well, my husband's a captain still. And also we started a business together years ago, a seagoing business, and we still have that, and I still run it, and I'm still kind of the face of it. Like, when people inquire with us, they know my name more than his. And so I kind of am still involved with that a little bit, but not in the way that I was before.
Well, I'm just sad because I want to go out on one of those boats with a bunch of scientists, and like, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I'm very sad. But I actually wanted to ask, this was obviously kind of over time, but it was also a really huge career transition. And now I know you're transitioning into podcasting. And I was wondering what lessons did you learn from that previous big transition that are kind of helping you now as you go forward into another transition?
I think for me, it was really hard to show that my skills, my leadership skills, my problem solving skills that I learned on the sea were relevant to podcasting or to science writing. That was really hard to show. So I had to find ways to show that. I had a lot of people that were really interested and curious about me. They wanted to hear, kind of like how we started this conversation. It was different. They wanted to hear the story. And I come from a world where all my friends and everybody that I brushed elbows with were all living on boats and traveling all the time. Like, whose spouse is in, who's alone? Like, can I mow your lawn? Can I crash on your couch? Like, that's the life that I lived before. And so it's not super strange to me, but I kind of learned how to, as I talked about it, to try to show how it was relevant to the work that I'm doing now. It's still hard to show that. I think it was also hard to show my commitment to this career change. People often thought that I would just go back to doing this other adventurous life, but I was over it. You know, I'm ready to move on. This is a new adventure for me. I don't know what lessons that I can use now, except that it was really hard. And I think also, to add another wrench to my puzzle, was I had a baby at the same time. So I'm going from whole life, a transient life, a nomadic life, to one living in one place and trying to build community and trying to build a new career and trying to raise a child. And then, of course, a pandemic. I mean, we can all say that. And anything we say from now on, we can just say, and then, of course, a pandemic. And so there was, when we're talking about these mid-career, I really appreciated this program because I applied for a lot of these fellowships, and I distinctly remember one that was a radio podcast audio fellowship. And I was going to go to this, and my baby was so young, and it was on a campus, like you had to be there. And it's early career, and I'm like, I'm early career, but I'm midlife. So there's this interesting thing there. And really, when they mean early career, I find a lot of times they mean young, single, with, you know, ability to move around a lot. And that's, but I was early career. And so I thought, this is for me, this is gonna be great for me. And it would have been great. But ultimately what it came down to is that I had to be on campus. I couldn't stay nearby with my husband and baby, so I could nurse my baby. This was the whole thing. I wanted to keep nursing my baby. And then they're like, no, you can't do that. Okay, I'll live on campus. Can my husband and the baby stay there too? No, they can't do that. Okay, you know, just trying to figure out how to make this work. And eventually they're like, you won't have time to nurse your baby. You won't even have time to take breaks. And I mean, it's like 10 minutes, you know. If you have time to go to the bathroom, you have time to nurse the baby. But so that was a challenge for me. And there's just a lot of that. It's really interesting. Like when you're doing a career transition, there's a lot of expectations that you fit a certain path. And I did not in any way fit any of those paths. And to, you know, I wanted to write for, I won't even say who, because it's a big name, but I was talking to them and they were like, oh, I had this, they said, okay, I want an internship. No, you're too much, you have too many skills and too much experience for an internship. In some ways that's true. I ran my own company. And then I said, okay, what about an entry-level job? Well, I'm overqualified for an internship. I don't have the background for the first job. Like I didn't have enough experience to show. I was like, well, what do you suggest I do? They're like, well, you could volunteer for a while and get your foot in the door. Like, so there was like just so many things like that were very frustrating because I felt like some of the things that made me unique and brought something unique to the table were also big hurdles for me to show how they were valuable and relevant. I totally went off on a tangent.
No, that was enraging, but helpful. Not enraging because of you, but because of what you went through, because that's not okay. I am sorry.
Yeah, I think about it sometimes, and sometimes I think, oh, I would tell people don't do a midlife career change. But at the same time, we're not meant to be one thing all our life. We're dynamic people, we're interesting. And so we need to do these changes, and it's exciting and important, but man, it's not easy, even though like I should not be the copy girl, photocopying and getting lunch orders. Like I definitely am not that. Even when it was like my very first job in science journalism, I was way beyond that simply because I'm a professional already. But at the same time, it was hard to show people that because I didn't have the right previous career. Like it was almost nothing before that mattered anymore.
Well, thank you so much for sharing, and I hope this career program helps a little bit. And actually, I think it was Inessa Ramirez said in the chat that pivoting is an act of courage, and she is absolutely right. And also good with her words. She always has such beautiful words. So
I think regarding this this mentorship program, what I loved about this right as soon as I logged into the Slack, which I was delayed to log in because, but I saw a bunch of names that I recognized and I was like, holy cow, that person needs mentoring? That doesn't seem right. I was familiar with their work a little bit and like, wow, they're doing cool stuff. And yet here they are. There's many of you that are like that I recognize that I'm like, wow, they need mentoring. Okay, this is cool.
We all need mentoring. But I also wanted to go back a little bit to Rich and Roxanne because this is something that Teresa also kind of brought up in her career pivots. A lot of people worry when they're switching careers, and I feel like this is good, especially for Roxanne, that they won't be able to switch back, that once you step through that door, the previous door is closed, you were done. And this is especially true, I know, for a lot of journalists who worry about, say, becoming a PIO, working in institutional writing. They're worried they won't be able to go back, or for a freelancer going to staff or a staff going to freelance. Is this true? Do we pivot and then we're stuck, or can we keep turning? Can we turn backward? Are there other terrible metaphors to make other than turning?
I don't think that any one phase, I'm sorry, I wrote some notes to address this. I don't think there's any one job that defines us, just to echo what was said, and like, we're human beings. I think, with regards to the PIO thing, the conflicts of interest and you kind of want to be able to showcase writing that is purely journalistic and not institutional, if you're going to pivot to something that's not that it's a must do, but it would help. So for me, my thought process was similar because I was in trade for so long, and then I really wanted to go to like something a little bit more general. So in some ways, it's like you have to be a chameleon, like you have to kind of wear different hats and like almost adopt a different persona. I would always, when I was trying to pivot, I would always take, and I still do this. This is something I will do the rest of my life. When I want to pivot to a new place that I haven't been part of before, I will like take and print out or have that tab open, excuse my 1,000 tabs, of just examples of what that publication or that style of publication that I'm aiming for, kind of how they frame things. Just because a lot of what we do, I know we're talking kind of about high level things here, but a lot of what we do is really just like sentences and structure and things like that. So I really try to see the recipe that I'm like trying to go after. And yeah, I really don't think that like if you're going from trade to consumer or vice versa, or if you're going from a job in an institution to something that's not, or again, the other way, like it's really just how you showcase your skill set. So at the end of the day, that is all that matters, I think. Although other people might have experiences they want to share on that.
I would chime in and say, it's not impossible to say go from print journalism to a PIO job and then back. It becomes all the more harder if you're not continuing to do journalism on the side. And if you are doing journalism on the side of another job, hoping to get back into a full-time journalism career, then you don't have to think quantity, you just need to think quality, because one or two outstanding clips over the course of a year is plenty to demonstrate that you still have the chops. But I do think that you make it all the harder for yourself if you get out of journalism and say, don't write a reported story for the next 5 years, then and you're competing against people who have. So that might seem obvious, but I think the most important kind of wrinkle is focus on quality.
So I also wanted to ask, one of the things that's been coming up a lot in the Slack is kind of the constraints on career pivots that come up because we are mid-career, because we have families, and because we're mid-career, and so our bodies are breaking down and I require health insurance. My orthopedic is not free. And so I was wondering if you guys could talk about some of the constraints that come with that and how you've handled those as you've done career pivots.
So when I went off to Russia in the mid-90s for the Fulbright, I basically didn't have health insurance that year that I was overseas. There was a basic like emergency evacuation policy that comes with the program, but you know, it depends on where you are in life. I was single, I was much younger, felt healthy, so I was willing to take that risk. It's as you say, as you get older and you have a family, then you would be unwise to go into that situation without health insurance. So, but for me, you know, taking that step at that time in my life made sense. So I think you really have to evaluate where is your threshold for risk, and if you are willing to, you know, gamble on something like that, that is entirely your decision. But I think a lot of people are more conservative and look for situations where they can maintain health insurance even as they freelance.
Yeah, I mean, I think as maybe as a health reporter, and also as I've recently just like, I've had the insight that I'm kind of like the Forrest Gump of medical adventures, except like not in quite the positive way. Like I just have had a lot of material firsthand that has, you know, knock on wood, I'm okay right now, but like not having health insurance was never an option for me. There's obviously like a range, like if you're in the US where I've spent most of my life, there's a range of ways you can buy into the health system now independently. And I think that's actually somewhat improved since when I was getting started a couple decades ago. So I think even just having like there was a period in my life when I had just like, when I was freelance and I just had the basic like emergency, I was younger, again, not my body wasn't breaking down the way it is now. But when I part of my calculus was healthcare when I went freelance, and that is part of the reason I moved to Canada. The joke's on me because I moved to Quebec, where you know, a lot of people can't get a family doctor here. It's very the waits to see doctors are extremely long, and you know, you don't end up paying as much, but sometimes you have to wait 4 years to get a torn ACL fixed if it's not keeping you from activities, which is the situation one of my friends is in. Partly hampered by the pandemic, but not just that. So, but yeah, I mean, like, obviously not everyone can move to Canada, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for everyone. I'm part Canadian, so that's what facilitated it. But I do think that having that knowledge of what plan that you would select before you go freelance, and also, you know, looking at deductibles and all that stuff is certainly worthwhile. And also I'm single, so I think that's something that's not really talked about in this conversation oftentimes about career choices and things like that. So, you know, I don't have a spouse to like foot the bill if I don't make the income I need a certain amount of time. So that can be pretty challenging too.
So I did actually kind of want to follow up on that because, you know, we're all talking about how we're going to plan for our pivots and what to do if things don't necessarily go, you know, like what to do when you know, are gonna, you know, choose your health insurance plan before you go freelance and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is that for a lot of us, career pivots come like whoops, things did not go as planned. Layoffs happen. And, you know, sometimes people just really end up scrambling. And I was wondering if anybody had, you know, experience of a career pivot that kind of, you know, caught them unawares, and what they ended up doing.
Rich, do you want to speak to that one?
I wish I could. My career pivots have been planned. Although, as I said, I kind of walked away from a staff job at Science Magazine to go off to Russia, but it was different circumstance. I did a second Fulbright in the mid 2000s, but had two kids, you know, at that time, young boys, and a lot more forethought went into determining, you know, how to cover the family costs and the you know, making sure we had health insurance. And we were in Kazakhstan for the year, so you know, all those factors I had to weigh when deciding what to do in that situation. And then my most recent career pivot was simply looking to take on a new challenge, and that was something I'd been mulling for some time. But certainly at this stage in life, it was very much planned, looking for the right fit, the right sort of position.
I would say, sorry.
Roxanne, please.
I was just gonna say my safety net in terms of anticipating like unexpected transitions is like spreadsheets. So I have like one spreadsheet of story ideas that kind of just acts as a sense of security, because I know if something changes, I can go there and like start pitching tomorrow of, you know, other ideas. Similarly, like with lists of editors, I can reach out to them to say, hey, are you planning a special issue, which is something I really meant to mention earlier. This was some of the greatest advice I got, you know, a few years back. Was one way to do the kind of bread and butter stories, or to find articles to help pay the bills, is to either look at the, sometimes magazines will have like a media kit for people who want to advertise, saying we're going to plan this year to do a special on this. I actually find those harder to detect online these days. I don't know if they're not doing them as often or they're not advertised. But like, and also it's a great way to get your foot in the door. So I've just kind of try to have all these safety nets around me. One is that spreadsheet. One is thinking about special issues. If that helps. I don't know if that helps folks in terms of my mentioning that.
Well, I can say I did actually have one of those sudden career pivots. I was young at the time, but it was when I literally, well, not literally, figuratively flunked out of academia. In that I was a postdoc and I went on the tenure track job search and I did not get one. And then my postdoc funding was cut. And first I had a nervous breakdown. Then I basically just ended up I threw everything at the wall until I found something that stuck. So I was applying for jobs like mad. I also took an internship I took an internship and I did that while I was also freelancing at night, and just tried everything until it stuck. And the one thing I did find out is that I do not respect authority enough to work in government. But I see we have another question from Chris Gorski. So Chris, go ahead.
Thanks. Can somebody let me know if you can hear me? Okay. So I guess somebody was talking just a minute ago about kind of unintentional career pivots or pushes, and I've kind of had one of those pushes recently. I mean, I knew that things were coming, but my publication shut down about 2 weeks ago, and so I had some forewarning, and that was nice, but nothing has really prepared me for the like train getting to the end of the track kind of part of it. And what's been really good for me is reaching out to people, because I was able to, you know, I had a lot of freelance writers that I was working with. I could go to tips who have offered, you know, I didn't realize that people would be so kind to offer out their editor's contact information and that kind of stuff. And just by cycling around, I've managed to get a couple of assignments to get me started, and that's really nice, and it's really great to celebrate those. But I am looking at this as kind of a long haul that's going to take work and effort, and I really like showing up on Monday morning trying to figure out what was going to happen and not being like, I get to drive what's going to happen come Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. But so just, for me, it's been interesting to see it happening, and this program's coming up at such a great time for me. So I really appreciate it. And I don't know if that's helping anybody, but good luck to anybody else finding themselves in that kind of situation.
I think that does help, and I'm so sorry that this has happened. But I think that does help, and that actually leads to another question that came up in the chat. Rich, Roxanne, are there any tips on dealing with the imposter syndrome that happens immediately after making a career pivot? Especially if you're moving into a different line, a different beat, a different medium. How do you keep self-doubt from creeping in? And I know we talked a little bit about this in the prep. There's also kind of a transition that occurs in identity. I know, for example, when I stopped being a scientist, that was actually a real blow to my identity. So how do you kind of deal with that shift and that imposter syndrome?
Maybe I'll start off. So I was in a PhD program at UPenn in biophysics, and kind of forcing myself to do that. I certainly had some expectation that I would become a scientist. It wasn't from my parents or anything like that. It just I was interested in science, and it felt like the natural career path. But I realized I hated working in a laboratory, and I'd always enjoyed writing. I realized, that it was foolish to continue for me personally, and I bailed out of the PhD program. I ended up going to the UC Santa Cruz Science Writing Program, and I think a lot of people in the Santa Cruz program have a similar experience. I'm not, certainly nothing new when you look at the people applying for the program. Many of them have science backgrounds and decided that they didn't want to be a scientist. But for me, it was liberating because I felt, instantly felt I was part of the right tribe. I was not forcing myself to write. I enjoyed it very much. I was still a lot to learn going through the program, but I realized I'd made the right decision. So I think, for me, it was a great transition to make.
I'll add to that. But first, I wanted to just also say that to Chris, I'm sorry that happened to you. But what you mentioned about like reaching out to people reminded me how I see on Twitter so many times people saying like, this happened to me. I'm in a transition. So I think that it seems to me that like people talking about their career pivots out loud, thinking through the process out loud. I don't know if it's because we're a little nerdy that we're better to each other, but I always feel like science journalists are very like supportive, and health journalists are very supportive of each other. So I do think there's a value in kind of being as open as you feel comfortable being about the situations that you're in as things come up unexpected or not. And in fact, when I made the transition, I did a whole thread thanking folks that wrote for me and saying I'm no longer an editor. And that actually spurred people to reach out to me to say, hey, you're freelance now. So blah, 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 blah. And I also saw a name in the chat that reminded me, and the mention of imposter syndrome reminded me that I also want to speak a little bit to gender dynamics a little bit. That I think oftentimes as an editor, I saw women, if I said no to a pitch, I would never hear from them again. And so I just want to say that like part of pivoting to freelance for me was just really tapping into this thing of like, if I hear a no, it doesn't mean no forever. And to look at the Open Notebook database of pitches as a model for kind of like, actually, it's wonderfully sorted into different categories. So you can see how people pitch news versus features. So if you're actually pivoting within journalism styles, that's actually a nice thing to do. And then lastly, regarding imposter syndrome, which I read a thread on Twitter about how I'm not supposed to say imposter syndrome because it makes me the person who's I'm putting the guilt of the like it's society. I'm not, I don't know. But so I would just say that the time that I've most recently felt a little bit beyond my depth or out of my depth was when I got the call to host On the Media, which is actually not a science journalism show, right? So it's a media show. And I had done a segment on COVID, and I think they just needed someone to fill in to guest host the episode. And it's one of my favorite radio programs. So I was totally terrified. I think my adrenaline like shot up when they asked me. But I think that you just kind of got to go, like, even if you feel that you're doing something that you're not used to, you kind of have to trust that people will support you to get where you need to go. And as long as you're listening to the advice, like I think you got to just take a risk. That's the end of yeah.
So this is probably the last few minutes before we go to the unrecorded portion, but I did just see something in the chat asking for resource suggestions for pivoting to book writing. And I just wanted to say that Christy Ashwanden is running a thing right now on book proposals. It's a seminar on book proposals. I have not done it, but I know people who have, and they all give it uniformly rave reviews. And so I know that in the seminar series that that she runs for book proposals, it's all science-related book proposals, I think. And she has a lot of book authors come and talk, and she also has an agent come and talk. So you learn a lot about the process. So I highly, highly recommend that. And now I just wanted to spend this last minute before we switch is asking, how do we kind of build and kind of nurture a professional network for a pivot? Because of course, if you're nurturing that network, you know, you might not be necessarily, it might be doing something that doesn't look like your job, right? So how do you kind of go about nurturing that? Do you have any tips? I know Roxanne makes many lists. I love lists. So are there any tips on that?
I think journalists, we're all used to doing research for a story, right? So we do as much reporting as we can before we feel comfortable writing. And I think making the pivot's the same way. You're researching what are the possibilities. You are trying to figure out what sort of skills you have to acquire. You're talking to people already in the industry. Before I went over to Tangled Bank Studios, I reached out to some of the producers over there to find out just what I might be able to bring to the table, what it was like working in film. I mean, I really had no idea. So you have to kind of do that sort of spade work, I think, if you have the time before making a pivot.
That inspired me and reminded me that kind of early on when I was still living in Europe freelancing, I applied for the Richard Casement internship at The Economist, and which I think they probably still do. It was a long time ago. If they still do it, that's amazing because it's literally decades later. But Rich, what you said about researching reminded me that I really research the people I pitch to. So like I will look at their LinkedIn, I'll try to understand who they are, because I believe that it allows me to pitch them better. And what taught me that was when I was applying for this Richard Casement internship, I was living in Latvia, working at the Baltic Times, because I did spend a year where I pivoted to like writing or editing a newspaper about Eastern Europe. But I remember I found the phone number for the Economist magazine, had the person at the switchboard connect me to the science desk. Somebody picked up who wasn't the editor I was applying to. And I was like, what is he like? And she was like, he really is into HIV, like stories about HIV, AIDS research. And I was like, great. So I did a whole pitch about that research in Eastern Europe. And, so I would say if you're trying to cultivate a relationship with an editor, really find out who they are. Like, what are the stories that inspire them and that they are drawn to? Because you kind of connect with them on that.
So we're proceeding to the non-recorded portion. So thank you very much. 1 second.